Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. The customs related to the passing of our loved ones have changed over the years. One such custom was the sitting up in the home of the deceased with the body until burial. But for Victor, with his overactive imagination, a simple wake became a night of stark, unreasoning terror. Join us for The Fearsome Touch of Death, adapted from a story by Robert E. Howard. Old Adam Farrell lay dead in the house where he had lived alone for the last 20 years. In his life he had known no friends, and only 2 men had watched his passing. Dr. Stein rose and glanced out the window into the gathering dusk. "You think you can spend the night here, then?" he asked his assistant. This man, Victor by name, assented. "Yeah, certainly. I guess it's up to me." "It's rather a useless and primitive custom, sitting up with the dead," commented the doctor, preparing to depart. "But I suppose in common decency we will have to bow to precedents. Maybe I can find someone who'll come over here and help you with your vigil." Victor shrugged his shoulders. "I doubt it. Farrell wasn't known by many people. I scarcely knew him myself, but I don't mind sitting up with the corpse." Dr. Stein was removing his rubber gloves, and Victor watched the process with an interest that almost amounted to fascination. A slight involuntary shudder shook him at the thought of those slick, cold, clammy things, like the touch of death. "You're not superstitious, are you?" the doctor remarked as he opened the door. Victor laughed. "Scarcely. To tell the truth, from what I hear of Farrell's disposition, I'd rather be watching his corpse than to have visited him in life." The door closed and Victor took up his vigil. He seated himself in the only chair in the room and glanced casually at the formless, sheeted bulk on the bed opposite him, and began to read by the light of the dim oil lamp which stood on the rough table. Outside, the darkness gathered swiftly, and finally Victor laid down his magazine to rest his eyes. He looked again at the shape which had, in life, been the form of Adam Farrell, wondering what quirk in the human nature made the sight of a corpse such an object of fear to many. Was it seeing in dead things a reminder of death to come, he wondered, and began idly contemplating as to what life had held for this grim and crabby old man who had neither relatives nor friends, and who had seldom left the house where he had died. The usual rumors of hoarded wealth had accumulated, but Victor felt so little interest in the whole matter that it was not even necessary for him to overcome any temptation to pry about the house for possible hidden treasure. He returned to his reading with a shrug. The task was more boring than he had thought. After a while he was aware that every time he looked up from his magazine and his eyes fell upon the bed with its grim occupant, he started involuntarily, as if he had, for an instant, forgotten the presence of the dead man, and was unpleasantly reminded of the fact. The start was slight and instinctive, but he felt almost angered at himself. He realized for the first time the utter and deadening silence which enwrapped this house, a silence apparently shared by the night, for no sound came through the windows. Adam Farrell had lived as far apart from his neighbors as possible, and there was no other house within hearing distance. Victor went back to his reading. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the window, in which the light in the lamp flickered and went out suddenly. Victor, cursing softly, groped in the darkness for matches, burning his fingers on the hot chimney of the lamp. He struck a match, relit the lamp, and glancing over at the bed, got a horrible mental jolt. Adam Farrell's face stared blindly at him, the dead eyes wide and blank, framed in the gnarled gray features. Even as Victor instinctively gasped, his intelligent reasoning explained the apparent phenomenon. The sheet that had covered the corpse had been blown aside by the sudden gust of wind. Yet there was something grisly about the thing, something fearsomely suggestive, as if, in the cloaking dark, a dead hand had flung aside the sheet, just as if the corpse were about to rise. Victor was letting his imagination get the best of him, so he shrugged his shoulders at these ghastly thoughts and crossed the room to replace the sheet. The dead eyes seemed to stare at him malevolently, with an evilness that transcended the dead man's churlishness in life. He covered the gray face again, shrinking as his hand chanced to touch the cold flesh, slick and clammy, the touch of death. He shuddered. At last, growing sleepy, he lay down upon a sofa which formed part of the room's scant furnishings. He decided to leave the light burning, telling himself that it was in accordance with the usual custom of leaving lights burning for the dead, not willing to admit to himself that he was actually a little fearful of lying in the darkness with the corpse. He dozed, awoke with a start, and looked at the sheeted form on the bed. It was silent in the house, and outside it was very dark. The hour was approaching midnight, with its accompanying eerie domination over the human mind. Victor glanced again at the bed where the body lay, and found the sight of the sheeted object most repellent. A fantastic idea had started to form in his mind that beneath the sheet, the mere lifeless body had become a strange, monstrous thing, a hideous, conscious being that watched him with eyes which burned through the fabric of the cloth. This thought, a mere fantasy of his imagination, of course, he explained to himself by the result of reading too many books about the legends of vampires, zombies, ghosts and such, the fearsome attributes with which the living have cloaked the dead for countless ages. Man feared death, and therefore they also feared the dead. At any rate, that silent, hidden thought was getting to his nerves. He decided to turn off the light so he would stop looking at the corpse and possibly forget its existence long enough to get some sleep. It worked, and Victor fell asleep almost instantly. He awakened suddenly. How long he had been asleep he didn't know. He sat up, his pulse pounding frantically, cold sweat beading on his forehead. He knew instantly where he was, remembering the other occupant of the room. But what had awakened him? A dream. Yes, now he remembered. A hideous dream in which the dead man had risen from the bed and stalked stiffly across the room with eyes of fire and a horrid leer frozen on his gray lips. In the dream, Victor had been motionless, helpless. Then, as the corpse reached a gnarled and horrible hand, he had awakened. He strove to see through the gloom, but the room was all blackness, and the outside was so dark that no gleam of light came through the window. He reached a shaking hand toward the lamp, then recoiled as if from a hidden serpent. Sitting here in the dark with the fiendish corpse was bad enough, but if he lit the lamp, what might he see then? Horror, stark and unreasoning, had full possession of his mind. He no longer questioned the instinctive fears that rose in him. All those legends he had heard came back to him with a fierce belief. Death was a hideous thing, a brain-shattering horror, imbuing lifeless men with a horrid malevolence. Adam Farrell, in his life, had been simply a churlish but harmless man, but now he was a terror, a monster, a fiend lurking in the shadows of fear, ready to leap on him with talons dipped deep in death and insanity. Victor sat there, his blood freezing, and fought the silent battle in his mind. He tried to talk himself out of his fear and reason with his imaginative mind, but then a soft, stealthy sound again froze him. He didn't recognize it as the whisper of the wind across the windowsill. His frenzied imagination knew it only as the tread of death and horror. He sprang from the couch. He needed to escape, but even his sense of direction was gone. He stood frozen and unable to move. A new terror entered his mind as he thought that the dead man was behind him, was stealing upon him from the rear. He no longer thought of lighting the lamp. He no longer thought of anything. Fear filled his whole being. There was room for nothing else. He backed slowly into the darkness, hands behind him, instinctively feeling the way towards the direction of the door. With a terrific effort, he strove to orient himself. He could see nothing, but he was sure the bed was across the room, in front of him. He was backing away from it. There was where the dead man was lying. He was sure of it. He worked his way slowly backward, groping, clinging to the thought that the dead man must be in front of him. Then his hands encountered something slick, cold, and clammy, like the touch of death. A scream shook the echoes, followed by the crash of a falling body. The next morning, they who came to the house of death found 2 corpses in the room. Adam Farrell's sheeted body lay motionless upon the bed, and across the room lay the body of Victor, next to the table by the door, the table where Dr. Stein had absent-mindedly left his gloves, the rubber gloves, slick and clammy and cold to the touch, like the touch of death.